Welcome to Caravans of Gold. This is an exquisite exhibition that tells the story of medieval Africa. And it may not be an Africa that you know something about, because it's an Africa that was outward looking, that was innovative, that dominated the thinking of the age. This was an Africa that's influence stretched out not just to its very borders, but beyond, that dominated the thinking of the Middle East and Southeast Asia, that touched people across Europe right the way to my own homeland of Britain. And where its ideas went, also went its goods and its people. But this is a story of exchange, of how those ideas were exchanged and in turn transformed medieval West Africa. It's a story of caravans of gold. And it was created not just here in North America, but as a collaboration of experts from across Africa as well. We are enormously proud of it, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I have.
I think a lot of people think of the Sahara as like a sort of like the Atlantic, an impassable barrier, because it would be very hard for a modern New Yorker or Washingtonian or Parisian to start on the North African coast and make their way through the Sahara on their own. They would die. So it's hard to imagine that in fact it was more like the Mediterranean, that is, which isn't an obstacle, it's a way people travel. And so the desert was this apparently impassable desert was in fact full of trading routes, and the people who lived there had figured out how to use it, and that's why there's you can find traces of North African materials in West Africa and West African materials in North Africa. It's why there was an important trade in salt in one direction and gold in another direction and so on. It's why Mansa Musa, when he was the Emperor of Mali, could take so much gold with him on his way to do the Hajj in Mecca that he caused massive inflation in that part of the Mediterranean. So the idea that this is a kind of this is a lively, bubbling place, full of exchange, also, of course, full of conflict, warfare, as well as commercial and trading exchange, and that's why we should not think of the arrival of people in boats, European boats on the coast in the 15th century as the kind of beginning of exchange with Europe. That's absolutely not true, because obviously once you get things to the North African coast, then you're part of a trading system that's ancient. The Phoenicians did it long before the time we're talking about. And once things get up the Mediterranean, they can go into Europe and then actually out eastwards as well. So already in this medieval period, medieval we call it because it's the Middle Ages in Europe, travelers are going. There are travelers who went from West Africa to Beijing and wrote about it, traveling through a set of networks that had been created by the fact that once the Arabs burst out of Arabia to create the great Muslim empires that went all the way to Spain on the one hand and all the way into South Asia to what's now India on the other, and into Central Asia. That meant there were all these networks of Muslim societies, people connected not just by trade but by religion and by a sense of a common culture. They were all part of Dar el-Islam, the world al-Islam, the world of Islam.
My name is Aminata Fourna, and I'm a writer and a novelist. Before that, I was a documentary maker, and the first time I ever went to Timbuktu was because I was reporting a war. In fact, I was reporting on an uprising of the Tuaregs. But I became so struck by the country, its culture, its art, and its history that I would return to Timbuktu twice more to make documentaries about the art and history of that region. I think it's helpful when you visit a place like Timbuktu or Mali to think in terms of deep time. You have to think in terms of hundreds and hundreds of years, possibly even millennia. I remember talking to a Songhai chief when I was in Mali, and when I said something about the French Empire, he laughed, and he said, the French Empire? That didn't even last 100 years. For him, the Songhai Empire had lasted centuries. Before that, the Malian Empire had lasted for centuries. And before that, the Ghana Empire had lasted for centuries. So the way he thought was really in terms of millennia of time. He didn't think in terms of a few decades.
So this is a vast, connected world. I think it's so easy for us to think that. I don't know how this idea got around, but people sort of think as if, before Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, Africa and Europe and Asia were all sort of separate things. Far from it. If you look at just a map of all the trade routes, it's astonishing how densely trade was going on in this period. So I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind when you're starting to think about these societies in this period, that you're not looking into a place that was disconnected from the rest of the world. You're looking at a place that was part of this great system, this system of Europe and Africa and Asia, connected centrally by Islam at this point. And that's why, it's a rich world. It's a world full of the riches that come from trade.
I discovered from my family's oral history that we come from a place called Fouta originally. Well, if you start at the mouth of the Niger River, which is actually in Fouta is in modern-day Guinea. It was once its own state until from the 10th century right through to the 19th century, 18th century, when it was overrun by the French. So Fouta, think about this independent state in what is now modern-day Guinea, pretty much on the Atlantic coast. Then the Niger River flows inland, so it goes all the way to Timbuktu, and then it flows back out again. Right, now if you follow the curve of that river, you see civilizations all the way along it, ending up in Nigeria. If you think of Benin, the Benin bronzes. If you think of Timbuktu, the libraries, the heritage there. If you think of Djenné and the Great Mosque and the Djenné terracottas, and if you think of Fouta Djallon. So all of those were linked. But then there comes there's a sort of fork in the river, as it were, because at Timbuktu, you then have the caravans that were way back, hundreds of years ago, carrying gold and salt across the Sahara into the Arab world, and then take it from the Arab world and then keep going all the way to the east. That line then follows the Silk Road all the way to the east. So all of these worlds were connected, which is incredible to think. I mean, I've heard, a neat way to think about it is it goes Silk Road, then it goes Ink Road, or the Ink River, because that writing gets carried from, what is now the East, the Middle East. Writing then gets carried west and south into Africa, and of course into Europe and everywhere else, but into west and south into Africa. And then the next, phrase is camel meets canoe, and so the camels then, the goods get shipped then by river all the way down the Niger to Fouta Djallon. Who knows where from there?
So again, I think this sort of pervasive misunderstanding about West Africa as a kind of place where sort of, was outside history. In fact, Hegel, in his philosophy of history, says many interesting things, but he also says many absurd things. And one of the things he says about Africa is that there was no history there. Well, in the sense in which he meant it, that's just false. History means change, exchange, development, and development and recession, things going back and forth. And that's of course happening in the intellectual sphere and the material sphere in these parts of West Africa all the time, but in a particularly spectacular way in this period.